Like, all right, guys, I'm out here in the garage, and I actually said I wasn't going to film today. I was just out here doing some cleaning, checking my torque on some things, just going over everything I've done already thus far. But then I kind of ran into a dilemma, or something hit me. You know, the method that I use to pull the engine out of the car, where we lower it on a dolly, we pull it out, and that works great. But you also have seen at this point that I put the new block on an engine stand, and that's how I installed the head and the oil pump. So of course that is what has created my dilemma. Obviously, once the engine gets together, it's going to be really heavy. And with it being on the engine stand, it's up really high. And of course, an engine has an awkward shape. So all those things combined create a situation where I need to get it off of the engine stand and onto the dolly. Now, how do I do that? And so, of course, the obvious way to do it is to get a cherry picker engine hoist, and just lift it up and pull it on the dolly. But of course, if I had an engine hoist or had access to one, I would just take the hood off and then drop the engine in from the top. So what I've done here is borderline idiotic. But I guess it's not stupid if it works, right? So we're going to find out here. And I just wanted to document this just in case you guys are wondering how it got done. Without much further ado, here we are. So, yeah, it's not a whole lot to say. Of course, the engine is on a stand, but I was thinking about it, and obviously when you raise your jack, the base of the jack, especially with it being a low profile jack, slides underneath of the engine stand, right? So the front wheels are actually up here of the jack, and you raise the lift. So on top of this, I have one of my spare tires. Okay, this is no big deal. You see these tires are really good condition. The tires are probably worth more than the car. And the face of the jack is actually on the face of this. So the wheel is facing down, basically. Unfortunately, I took all my spare tires to my storage. I could go get them, but of course that'd be too much like a good idea. So I'm using one of my new tires to make up the distance. Then I've got some padding here, just to protect both the tire and the bottom of the engine. Of course, I don't have the oil pan on just because the oil pan is an awkward shape. So I think that would mess things up. And yeah, so I'm going to raise the jack up. So I'm going to raise the jack up, which should allow me to pull the engine, off of the stand. Because this is how these work. These kind of slide through this pole. And of course, this comes off. Of course, that comes off. Pull that bolt, a little pin that's normally right there, and you can pull the engine out. I have no idea whether this is going to work. This might be a stupid idea. But we do what we got to do, and this allowed me to get this thing in here and be done with it. So if all that goes according to plan, the engine will be down a lot lower. I should be able to pick it up from there and slide it onto my little wooden dolly that's over here. You know what, guys? I think after all that, I wasn't even filming. So the good news is it did work, at least to this point. Now I have to figure out how I'm going to get it from the tires down to this dolly. Might just have to use some good old-fashioned brute force for that. Alright, there we go. It's pretty much drama-free. Alright guys, now that it's on the dolly, I can go over a few things and we can get ready to install the clutch. I've got it hanging over enough where I should be able to still balance the transmission. I really wanted to get this thing the other way, but the situation didn't quite play out like that. But this should work. The only problem I can see is maybe it wanting to topple over that way just because of the transmission once everything's back together. But that's really no big deal. So if you never use an engine stand like that, it just bolts up to where your bell housing bolts. So I just found some long bolts that threaded into it, and in this case they were actually too long, and I had to put a nut behind it. But that's all that is. So now I just got to take those off, and we can install the flywheel and the clutch. All right, guys. So sorry about that. My battery died, but yeah. So like I said, I'm just gonna take these bolts off. This is all that's to it. Of course, these arms move and you can loosen or tighten them, and that's how you get them to fit. So they fit a wide variety of engines. You won't have to do this step, but I'm going to go ahead and remove this plate here just because it's bent. That way I can get it straightened back out. I'm actually just going to replace it with my other one and then straighten this later. So we do have one more obstacle before we can start installing our clutch and flywheel. And that's to remove this pilot bearing. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's this piece down here. So there's a bunch of methods to get this out. There's some pulleys. There's a method using grease. But my favorite method is the bread method. Alright, so I do not have any bread. So I can't do it that way. So if you wonder what I'm talking about as far as my bread method, I did put a clip of it in my initial 5-speed swap video. If I can find the clip, I'll go ahead and put it in this video. If not, go ahead and check that one out. So you're gonna pack this in that hole, and I'm gonna use just a bolt that I found, that pretty big bolt. And I'm just gonna hammer it in there. And what you'll hear is that eventually it'll bottom out. Once you hear the bolt hitting metal, you try to repack it. And I don't know if you saw that, but the pallet bearing actually moved a little bit. And you see at this point, it's actually loose. So I'm just gonna repeat the steps. Kind of ball the bread up a little bit to help get it in there. And you guys see that? Oh, and there it goes. It's really straightforward. All you do is pack bread down into the hole, and then you use an extension or a big bolt and just smash it down. And you just keep adding pieces of bread. And it actually took less than half of a piece of bread to get it out. But basically, as you push it in there, like the bread pushes the bushing out from the back. You can do the same thing with a thick grease. Now I have this kit here. I'm gonna try to use this. But if this doesn't work, I'm gonna have to make a trip to the grocery store. So what this is, you get a slide hammer and a couple pullers. And this is all that is. You tighten down this piece and it spreads these jaws here. This one fits. I get a hand tight. And all we have to do now is take the weight so it is coming out, but it's taking a lot more effort than just that piece of bread would. So I'm going to spray this down with some PB Blaster and then keep going at this and get this out. There we go. You can see, guys, that took probably a good solid 2 or 3 minutes worth of pulling. But you can see what it does as it expands behind it. It just pulls it out. Yeah, but do yourself a favor, get you a loaf of bread. It's a perfect use for those end slices that nobody wants. So this is probably unnecessary because these bolts probably have not come off since it was installed at the factory. So now we got our flywheel, but you want to make sure you're using the manual transmission bolts. So I know I've mentioned this before, but you want to make sure that you use the right bolts. You want to use the manual transmission bolts because they are longer. These particular bolts have 38 stamped on them. Yeah, you definitely do not want to use the bolts that you pulled out of here. Obviously, the longer one is the manual transmission bolt, and the shorter one is the auto. So that's why it's important to use the right bolt. So of course you remove that bushing from the automatic. The manual uses this little pilot bushing thing here. The hole in the middle is going to help you align the clutch. Now we got to do is line this up. So I'm just going to put a couple bolts in just to get them seated, and then I'll take them out and put the Loctite and then torque them back down. All right, so all the bolts are in. They got some Loctite on them. So now we just need to torque these down. All right, so these bolts need to be torqued down to 98 foot-pounds. So of course, we're going to do that in 3 stages. So I'm going to do it 30, 60, and then 98. But of course, that's going to present its own problems because this is going to want to spin as we tighten them down, especially when we get up there. But we will get to that when it's time. So when you go to tighten these down, you want to do it in a star pattern, similar to how you would do it if you were installing wheels. So, go here in that sort of pattern. All right, so this is my solution to torquing down these bolts without the flywheel moving. And I use the pressure plate bolts to hold it in. And of course, the other end is on the ground. So anyway, so I tend to... All my bolts are at 30 pounds. So now we're going to go up to 60. All right, so we're done. Our bolts are all at 98 foot-pounds. So with that done, now we're going to install our friction disc and our pressure plate. So we're going to go over to the bench, get it unboxed. I'll show you what I have, and then we'll be back down here to finish this up. All right, guys, so like I said before, we have an Action Stage 3 clutch with the 6-puck disc. Normally I would have went with ACT, but they were out of stock when I went to order. And Action has got a bunch of good reviews from different crowds. They normally have good prices, and they always have discount codes. So if you're looking into something like this, definitely check out the discount code. So the first thing we have in the package is our friction disc. Of course, like I said, it is a 6-puck. I got the sprung version, which means there are actually springs in here. So what I like about this design is that these springs are captive. On normal street disc, you don't have this extra plate here, and you can actually see the springs behind here. Where this is nice is if for whatever reason it were to fail, that spring is not going to pop out and then rattle around your transmission, causing a bunch of damage. This should hold it in place. If you look at the spec disc, you can see what I mean. So obviously these springs are exposed, so if one of these were to fail, it would just rattle around in the transmission and could damage other pieces. Oh, we got some goodies in here, so I'm going to put my gloves on because my hands are filthy. I tell you, I'm slightly backwards. I'm going to put my gloves on because my hands are dirty, because I don't want to touch these new parts with my dirty hands. But anyway, so we got some warranty information, big old sticker, another sticker. We got a little lanyard. This thing is flimsy, but you know, it's whatever, it's nice. And our pressure plate. So the pressure plate looks good. It feels heavy. It's definitely heavier than the Stage 2 spec. And what we have in here, this is your clutch alignment tool. And we're gonna need this. You can buy these separately. It actually says, Honda on it. I'm not sure if it's gonna make that out. Now I think the D series Hondas have the same spline count, but you know, whatever, as long as it works. And then this is this should be the throwout bearing. Now I won't be using this. I've always been a little hesitant about aftermarket throwout bearings. I have a OEM throwout bearing that I put in here when I did the transmission swap that was brand new. So that's still in good shape. I'm sure this works fine, but I won't be needing it. All right, so we're gonna take our pressure plate, our disc, and our clutch alignment tool. All right, so we are ready to install. So if we look at our disc, you'll notice that one side has flywheel side on it. This side, so that means that this is the back. It's gonna go like this. So the thicker section goes out. Now when we go to put this on, we want to go ahead and put our alignment tool into the disc, and we're gonna line it up with our pilot bushing. And that's all that is. That's just gonna help keep it centered. I can go ahead and remove these bolts. So next we're just gonna slip our clutch plate on. Now this does go on a certain way, so you'll just have to turn it until you find out where the holes line up. But it should be flush, because as you see, this does have pieces that protrude, and then you have these little grooves that are in the flywheel. So all that should line up. So I think we're good. We're just gonna tighten this down. And while I'm doing this, I do want to re-emphasize, you do not want to use an impact when you're installing these bolts. Of course, these are small bolts, and these only need to be torqued down to like 15 pounds. So you can't snap these really easily, and this is not an area where you want to have to deal with that. So now I've got all the bolts in, they're all finger tight. So I'm just gonna come behind with my ratchet and just snug these up. And it's just gonna make it a little bit easier when we go to torque it down. We don't have to turn it as much, but we're still gonna go in a star pattern. So, and what you'll notice is that as we tighten these down, these fins will actually go flat. All right, so now that everything is snugged up, we're gonna go ahead and torque these bolts down. Now these bolts are actually only 13 foot-pounds, so it's very little pressure, which is why I say do not use an impact on it, because it's almost guaranteed that you'll snap these bolts off. Now 13 foot-pounds isn't a lot, and just as a personal preference, when I get toward the lower end of the torque ratings, I like to use this here. This is an inch-pound torque wrench. As you see, it uses a gauge as opposed to the traditional like twist it and set it method. So as we apply pressure, this needle here is going to move in that direction and tell us how many inch-pounds that we're going to be at. All right, so now everything should be torqued down to about 155, 56 inch-pounds. I'm going to go back over it just to make sure that they're all even. You may have noticed that the splines in the middle have flattened now, and the clutch is sitting flat up against the flywheel. And actually, guys, I just realized that I made a mistake because I did not put any Loctite on these bolts. So I'm going to take them all back out and do it again. I'm not going to film that because it's the same process. I'm just putting Loctite on the bolts. So I will be right back. All right, so now it is torqued down. The bolts are Loctited. And now we're ready to put our transmission back on. So, of course, we want to pull this out. This should come out smoothly. So I did want to show you, if you're looking at the side, it should sit flush all the way around. Like, so if you're doing this for the first time, you are going to want to put grease on your input shaft and around the throwout bearing. Right, so now we can line this thing back up. I like to use the starter. I like to use the starter holes just as a reference. So I know you guys put your transmission bolts in a bag, so we don't have to look for them. And now we're just gonna thread these in. And so now I just gotta bolt this thing in, and just like everything else, we're gonna do it hand tight first. That's gonna make sure that the bell housing is sitting flush. So the only thing with this that I do want to point out is that those shorter 14mm bolts that go on the bottom, I'm not gonna put those in yet. I'm gonna wait until I get the engine in the car, and then I'll put those in. But everything on top I can go ahead and button up. That's really it. Installing the clutch with the engine out of the car is really simple and really easy, which is why I recommend that if you're looking to get a Galant and do a head swap and a transmission swap, go ahead and pull the engine out when you get started. It makes everything a lot easier, because at that point the transmission swap is really just running those cables, which is still going to be a pain in the ass, and drilling a hole. And the same thing for the head swap. The hardest part about that is just doing the timing in the car, because there's so much stuff over there. But with the engine out of the car, doing the timing is a breeze as well. So it is something to consider if you know what your plans are going to be from the beginning. I'll update you guys on this clutch, so just make sure you stay tuned for that. But as always, guys, I want to thank you for watching my video. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. Have a great day.